Silas, a man forged from silence and the relentless grind of dust, dragged his days beneath a merciless sun that scorched the very air he breathed, each deep furrow etched into his weathered face a stark testament to the words he could never decipher, a silent agony mirroring the parched earth around him. The phantom echoes of cruel laughter, a distant venomous chorus of "A woman who reads won't wed," still resonated from a past long buried, a jagged scar upon his rustic soul, twisting his insides with the bitter shame of his own profound ignorance. His only companions in this desolate tableau were the cutting wind that keened like a lone coyote through the groaning, sun-warped planks of his isolated shack, its mournful sigh a constant presence, and the pervasive, choking scent of dry soil, a fine grit that seemed to permeate everything, settling in the back of his throat. The distant, mournful lowing of cattle, or the shrill cry of a hawk circling high above the shimmering heat. Haze. Each faint sound served as a brutal, stark reminder of his stark, solitary existence, pushing him further into the quiet confines of his own mind, a world where letters were mere meaningless squiggles. Yet on a particular day, the oppressive, familiar silence of his world was abruptly shattered, not by the wind's mournful song, but by the unsettling groan of an abandoned wagon, its rusted wheels frozen in the dust, stumbled upon amidst a clump of parched skeletal scrub brush that offered little shade. Inside its shadowed interior, slumped against a tattered canvas, lay a fragile, almost ethereal feminine figure, her skin burning with the unmistakable fire of fever, her slender, translucent fingers clutching with a desperate, almost deathly grip onto a single leather-bound book, its worn pages whispering untold stories. This object, an accursed symbol of a vibrant, terrifying world he could not possibly touch, instantly stirred a violent maelstrom of conflicting emotions within. His calloused chest, an ingrained visceral repulsion warring fiercely with a forbidden, almost painful surge of raw curiosity that tightened his gut. The crushing, paralyzing fear of the unknown, an ancient dread that clung to him like the desert dust, and the long dark shadow of past ridicule. Those stinging taunts wrestled against a nascent, unfamiliar urgency, a spark of sheer, undeniable humanity that flickered precariously within his hardened heart, refusing to be extinguished. The woman, her breath ragged, stirred amidst her delirium, her lips parting to murmur brokenly of forgotten debts and a weighty secret, one inextricably buried within the very pages she guarded with her weakening life, a burden now too heavy for her fevered grasp. As the sun, a smouldering ember in the western sky, began its slow, inevitable descent, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the parched earth, a silent, internal battle raged within Silas, far fiercer than any brawl he'd ever witnessed in a dusty saloon. The woman's fevered whispers, thin and reedy as the rustle of dry leaves, spoke of a burden too heavy, a secret intertwined with the very pages he could not decipher, and the sheer desperation in her grip on the book pierced through the thick hide of his ingrained fear and shame. A primal, undeniable instinct, as ancient and unwavering as the desert itself, stirred in his chest, an echo of humanity that refused to be silenced by the ghosts of past mockery or the chilling dread of the unknown. He could not, in good conscience, leave her to the scavengers and the biting night air, no matter how much the cursed book, an emblem of his own perceived inadequacy, repulsed him. With a grunt that scraped his throat, Silas carefully, almost reverently, lifted her frail, burning form from the rough wagon bed, the surprising lightness of her body a stark contrast to the immense, invisible weight of the decision pressing down upon him. Her scent, a strange mix of illness and something faintly floral that spoke of a world beyond his comprehension. Later, as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, painting the scrubland in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, Silas found himself kneeling beneath the gnarled, twisting roots of an ancient mesquite, its branches like skeletal arms reaching towards the vast, indifferent heavens. The worn leather of the book, still faintly warm from her grasp, felt strangely heavy in his hand, tangible manifestation of a power he could not wield but instinctively understood. His calloused fingers traced the illegible symbols on its cover, a testament to a world of knowledge forever closed to him, before he thrust the rusty blade of his shovel into the unyielding earth. The dry, dusty soil resisted at first, then gave way with a gritty sigh, each scrape of metal against rock, a punctuation mark in the profound silence that had descended. He dug a shallow, hurried grave, the scent of damp earth and crushed roots rising to meet him, then carefully placed the book within its dark, cool embrace, covering it quickly, almost fearfully, as if trying to bury not just the object, but the complex, unsettling emotions it had churned within him. The secret, now sealed beneath the indifferent ground, belonged solely to the earth and to the illiterate cowboy, who, in his raw darkness, had begun to fathom the immense, unspoken weight of those forbidden words. With the earth now holding its new secret, Silas turned back to the wagon, the lingering scent of damp soil still clinging to his hands like a silent oath. Her form, impossibly light, yet imbued with a profound gravity, felt alien in his arms as he lifted her, her head lolling gently against his shoulder, a wisp of dark hair brushing his weathered cheek. The fever emanated from her in waves, a dry, oppressive heat that spoke of an internal fire raging, and her shallow, ragged breaths whispered against the fabric of his worn denim shirt, a fragile counterpoint to the vast silence of the plains. He moved with a hesitant, almost reverent slowness, each step across the sun-baked ground an intentional effort, the rough fabric of her dress a strange texture beneath his calloused fingers. The short distance to his cabin seemed to stretch interminably, burdened by the unspoken responsibility that now clung to him as persistently as the dust to his boots, a stark, uncomfortable realization settling deep in his gut that his solitary world had irrevocably shifted. He pushed open the groaning door of his shack with a foot, the sound echoing hollowly in the sudden, cooler darkness within, a new chapter opening with an unwelcome yet undeniable resonance. He laid her gently upon his rough cot, the thin mattress sighing under her weight, the worn blanket a poor comfort against the relentless chill that seemed to seep from her fevered core even in the stifling heat of the cabin. Her lips, cracked and parted, slightly in a barely audible moan, a sound that pricked at something deep within him. Unfamiliar and unsettling, Silas stood over her, a bewildered titan in his own cramped domain, his gaze tracing the delicate lines of her face, a stark contrast to the hard-bitten reality of his existence. He moved with an uncharacteristic clumsiness, fetching a tin basin of water from the rain barrel, the cold metal rattling against his trembling hands, before dipping a faded rag into its depths. The cool moisture, when applied to her burning forehead, seemed to offer scant relief, yet he persisted, a silent, grim determination carving itself into his features. Each tentative wipe was an acknowledgement of a silent, binding oath, a fragile thread woven between two strangers. And as the dim light of the cabin swallowed the last vestiges of twilight, he felt the heavy mantle of care settle upon his shoulders, a weight more profound than any rock he had ever lifted, knowing his solitude had been utterly, irrevocably shattered. The oppressive heat inside the small cabin, despite the fading daylight, seemed to cling to Silas like a second skin, mingling with the unfamiliar scent of sickness that now permeated the air, a stark counterpoint to the usual dry dust and aged wood. He dipped the rough cloth into the cool water again, the sudden chill on his calloused fingers a jolt, and gently pressed it against her forehead, feeling the fiery heat radiating from her skin beneath his touch, a stark reminder of her fragility. Each shallow breath she took was a rasping whisper in the dim quiet, a fragile rhythm that somehow synchronized with the frantic beating of his own heart, echoing the tumultuous shift within his very core. He found himself mesmerized by the delicate flutter of her eyelids, the almost translucent quality of her skin against the dark hair splayed across the worn pillow, and the sight stirred a strange, almost painful tenderness he hadn't known himself capable of, a sensation entirely alien to his desolate existence, pulling at the hardened edges of his soul with an insistent, disquieting urgency. The silence of the cabin, once a comforting shroud, now felt vast and intimidating, filled only with the soft sounds of her struggle and the heavy weight of his newfound unwelcome vigilance, each passing moment stretching into an eternity where his isolated world had abruptly, irrevocably expanded to encompass another's fragile, flickering life. As the moon, a sliver of silver light began to cast long skeletal shadows through the grimy window. Silas found himself an unwilling sentinel, unable to rest, his gaze fixed on the feverish woman whose presence had so violently upended his solitary order. The air grew heavy with the smell of sweat and the stale sweetness of fever, a scent that prickled at his nose and stirred a primal unease, yet he remained rooted, an immovable post in a world suddenly adrift. He watched the way her chest rose and fell, shallow and uneven, and a chilling fear, cold as the night wind whistling through the cabin's cracks, snaked its way around his gut. A fear not just for her, but for the profound, irreversible change her death would wreak upon the landscape of his own isolated life. Thoughts of the buried book, its hidden message flickered at the edge of his awareness, a distant, enigmatic beacon, yet for now, the tangible, immediate reality of her suffering eclipsed all else, demanding his full, awkward attention. He was caught in an unforeseen eddy, a man forged of silence now compelled to listen, a stranger to care now burdened by its inescapable heavy mantle, his rough hands, more accustomed to plough and rifle, now tasked with the delicate, terrifying art of keeping a fragile life from slipping away into the vast, indifferent night. The hours bled into each other, marked only by the shifting shadows of the lone candle and the woman's ragged breathing, a rasping sound that sawed at Silas's nerves, each exhalation a fresh cut on his raw sense of isolation. He had managed to dampen a worn rag with what little clean water he possessed, pressing it clumsily to her burning forehead, the sudden chill of the cloth a stark contrast to the inferno raging beneath her skin. A brief, fleeting moment of connection that sent a strange jolt through his own calloused fingers. Her delirious mumbles, fragments of names he didn't recognize and pleas he couldn't decipher, drifted through the small space, weaving themselves into the fabric of his thoughts, a disquieting tapestry of a life utterly alien, yet now inextricably linked to his own, forcing him to confront a world beyond the parched earth and his own weathered silence. The stench of sickness, acrid and cloying, seemed to fill every corner of the cabin, clinging to the rough-hewn walls and the tattered blankets, an unwelcome guest that threatened to smother the faint scent of dust and stale wood, his familiar companions. He felt a profound aching helplessness, a gnawing shame at his inability to mend this broken vessel. His hands, so capable with a pickaxe or a saddle, now trembling with an unfamiliar dread, a fear born not of wolves or bandits, but of the silent, relentless march of fever. As the first faint blush of pre-dawn light began to seep through the single grimy windowpane, painting the dust motes dancing in the air with a ghostly, ethereal glow, Silas felt an exhaustion settle deep into his bones, a weariness, more profound than any he had known from long days under the unforgiving sun. His eyelids felt like lead, his muscles ached from the unaccustomed tension, yet he found himself incapable of retreating to his own cot, his gaze still stubbornly fixed on the woman, her face now pale and slick with sweat, the fever finally seeming to break, a fragile, tenuous victory. The cabin, usually a sanctuary of oppressive silence, now hummed with a different kind of quiet, a strained, expectant hush that spoke of the night's long vigil and the uncertain promise of a new day. Each creak of the floorboards or distant coyote howl amplified in the newfound stillness. A flicker of something akin to relief, cautious and tentative, stirred within his chest, a sensation as foreign and disquieting as it was welcome, hinting at a connection he hadn't sought, a responsibility he hadn't chosen, yet one that now felt irrevocably woven into the very fabric of his solitary existence, a silent, binding thread that tugged at his hardened heart. The nascent light of the desert dawn, a pale whisper of rose and gold, crept through the gaps in the warped timber walls, illuminating the fine dust motes that danced ceaselessly in the stagnant air, painting them with a fragile, almost hopeful luminescence. Silas, still perched on the edge of his stool, his back aching from the night's unyielding vigil, watched the woman's chest rise and fall with a newly even rhythm, the ragged, desperate gasps of her fevered sleep now replaced by a softer, more regular cadence that felt strangely loud in the quiet room. Her skin, once flushed and slick with a dangerous heat, had taken on a damp, almost translucent pallor, revealing the delicate blue veins beneath the thin membrane of her temples, a stark contrast to the coarse, sun-weathered hide of his own hands. The acrid scent of sickness and sweat, which had clung to every surface of the small cabin throughout the long, dark hours, was gradually dissipating, replaced by the faint, earthy smell of the morning desert and the lingering, comforting aroma of stale coffee. A small, tentative victory against the encroaching dread. A strange, unfamiliar tenderness, as fragile as the morning light, pricked at the hardened casing of his chest, unsettling him profoundly, a feeling he quickly tried to smother beneath layers of ingrained stoicism, fearing its unfamiliar warmth. A low, almost inaudible groan escaped the woman's lips, a soft, reedy sound that scraped across Silas's raw nerves like dry tumbleweeds across sun-baked earth, causing him to flinch almost imperceptibly, his body tensing with an old, instinctual fear. Her eyelids, which had been stubbornly sealed shut for what felt like an eternity, fluttered once, then again, revealing a sliver of dark iris beneath their heavy lids, before settling back into a fragile stillness, a brief, startling glimpse of a consciousness stirring from the depths of her long delirium. He felt a profound, almost paralyzing dread creep up his spine, a cold knot tightening in his gut at the imminent prospect of her full awakening. The daunting reality of a human presence now fully aware within the confines of his solitary world. The unspoken words, the questions that would inevitably follow, the sheer impossibility of communication without the shared understanding of text, pressed down upon him like the oppressive weight of the desert sky, suffocating him with an acute sense of helplessness. The image of the buried book, its secret now belonging solely to the earth and himself, flashed in his mind, a heavy, silent accusation that compounded his anxieties, creating a suffocating pressure against his chest, an unseen hand gripping his very breath. Her eyelids once again stirred with a hesitant tremor, a subtle flutter that bespoke a consciousness clawing its way back from the depths of a long, feverish nightmare, this time opening fully to reveal eyes the color of deep river mud, unfocused and heavy-lidded as they blinked against the faint, dust-laden light that seeped through the cracks of Silas's crude cabin walls. A soft, almost imperceptible groan escaped her lips, dry and cracked, a sound that pierced the fragile quiet of the morning with a chilling clarity, bringing a new terrifying reality to Silas's ears and making his own breath hitch in his throat, a sudden knot of ice forming in his gut. He froze, a raw, primal instinct to flee warring with the strange, tender ache that had begun to bloom in his chest during the long, agonizing nights of her delirium. The rough blankets now seeming a flimsy, inadequate barrier between his solitary world and her encroaching, undeniable presence. The harsh, questioning reality of her gaze, though still clouded by weakness and confusion, forced him to confront the immediate, suffocating lie of the buried book, its secret a heavy, silent accusation pressing against the very foundations of his makeshift life, transforming his quiet refuge into a sudden, claustrophobic cage of his own desperate making. Riddled with a profound, debilitating fear of an interrogation he knew he could never answer, her weak gaze, like a slow-moving river, swept across the unfamiliar, Spartan confines of the cabin, tracing the rough-hewn planks, the worn earthen floor, the single smoke-stained lantern, before finally settling upon Silas, a flicker of confusion deepening into something akin to a desperate, dawning recognition, or perhaps a question so profound it resonated beyond words, vibrating in the stale air between them. A rasping whisper, barely audible above the insistent drumming of Silas's own heartbeat, emerged from her parched throat, a word or two that dissolved into unintelligible murmurs before reaching him, yet he felt an undeniable certainty that it was an inquiry for it, the book, the testament she'd clutched with her life. He instinctively clenched his hands at his sides, the rough, calloused skin of his palms, a stark, brutal contrast to the delicate, fever-worn skin he'd briefly tended, the vast, unbridgeable chasm of his illiteracy stretching between them like an impassable canyon. The silence that followed her weak utterance was deafening. Heavy with his rising panic, the full, suffocating burden of his deception, now vibrantly alive and breathing within the cramped space, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the dry grass outside, a potential harbinger of an unwelcome truth that threatened to unravel the fragile peace he had painstakingly built around himself, alongside the precarious hope that had stirred with her slow, agonizing recovery. Her eyelids fluttered, a fragile movement against the pale canvas of her face, and then, with a slow, deliberate effort, they lifted fully, revealing eyes the color of creek mud, now cleared of fever's haze, though still clouded with an immense weariness that seemed to pull at the very light in the room. Her gaze, unfocused at first, swept across the rough-hewn timbers of the small cabin, lingered on the dust motes dancing in the slender shafts of morning sun that pierced the single, grimy window, and finally settled upon Silas, who stood near the hearth, rigid as an old fence post, the scent of stale wood smoke clinging to his worn denim. A whisper, dry and reedy, escaped her lips, a sound less like a word and more like the rustle of dry leaves caught in a sudden gust, an involuntary expression of profound disorientation that tugged at something primal within Silas's chest, a fleeting, unwelcome ache that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed wall of indifference, the full, suffocating reality of her awakened consciousness, now a tangible presence, breathing in the confined space, demanding an interaction he was entirely unequipped to provide, forcing him to confront the inconvenient humanity of the situation. A tremor ran through her slender frame, a weak attempt to shift her position on the cot, but the effort was too great. Her limbs heavy with the lingering exhaustion of her ordeal, each muscle protesting the sudden return to awareness. Her fingers, still delicate despite the recent struggle, instinctively reached for the place on her chest where the book had been, a gesture so ingrained, so primal, that it spoke volumes before any sound could escape her lips, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly as they found only the rough wool of the blanket. A silent, dawning dread began to spread across her features, a subtle shadow that deepened the hollows beneath her cheekbones, as memory, like a cruel tide, began to lap at the edges of her conscious mind, bringing with it not just the pain of her body, but the sharper, more insidious sting of loss, a chilling realization that now resonated in the suffocating silence between them, pressing down on Silas with the weight of an unseen accusation, a silent question he knew he could not, dared not answer. Her eyelids, thick with the residue of fever and sleep, slowly peeled back, revealing irises the color of sun-baked earth, still clouded but now able to discern the rough-hewn ceiling above, the unfamiliar geometry of the cabin pressing in on her fragile consciousness. A low, pained groan, more a whisper of air escaping constricted lungs, scraped its way from her throat, a sound that snagged Silas's attention like a barbed wire across the quiet space, making his own breath catch in a sudden, involuntary spasm. Her gaze, still unfocused, swept across the sparse confines, past the flickering shadows cast by the newly risen sun, until it snagged on his stoic figure, standing awkwardly near the door, a silent sentinel in a world still hazy with memory. The silent question in her eyes, though wordless, was a palpable thing, a tendril of unease snaking around his gut, tightening with each moment she remained conscious, the very air in the cabin growing heavy with the weight of unspoken things and the relentless, impending clarity of her returning mind. Then, with a sudden, almost violent surge of strength that seemed to draw from some deep, buried wellspring, her hand shot out, weak and trembling, not reaching for Silas, but patting the empty space beside her on the cot, a desperate, instinctive search for the familiar weight that was no longer there. Her breath hitched, a thin, reedy gasp that seemed to tear through the fragile fabric of the morning, and a single, crystalline tear, thick with a mixture of fear and profound loss, welled in the corner of her eye, tracing a clean path through the grime on her temple. "The book," she croaked, her voice a dry, papery rustle, barely a sound, yet it detonated in Silas's mind with the force of a thunderclap, sending a jolt of ice through his veins, the memory of the mesquite root and the cold, damp earth suddenly vivid, burning, as the full, terrifying weight of his solitary act pressed down on him, suffocating him with the undeniable truth of what he had done. Silas's world fractured in that instant, the faint murmur of her voice shattering the carefully constructed silence he'd wrapped around his clandestine deed, the sound resonating not in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones, a chilling echo of the judgment he always feared. Her eyes, still hazy but now fixed upon him with an unsettling intensity, seemed to strip away the sun-baked layers of his stoicism, revealing the raw, unlettered fear that squirmed beneath, the shame of his ignorance a scorching brand on his soul as potent as any branding iron. The cabin, once a sanctuary of his isolated existence, now felt like a cage, its rough-hewn timbers pressing in, holding him captive under the weight of her unspoken question, the air thick and stifling, with the humid scent of sickness and the metallic tang of his rising panic. He could feel the pulse hammering at his temples, a frantic drumbeat demanding a decision, any decision to escape the suffocating scrutiny of her gaze, to silence the clamoring accusations that only he could hear, echoing from his past, present, and the terrifying, uncertain future. A guttural sound, not quite a word, escaped his lips, a raw, primal expulsion of air that was less an answer, and more an acknowledgement of the impossible truth now laid bare between them. And with a heavy, deliberate movement, Silas rose from his crouch, his frame stiff as if weighed down by unseen chains forged from guilt and burgeoning responsibility. His gaze, devoid of its usual evasiveness, met hers for a fleeting, searing moment, conveying a silent promise of action before he turned, his boots scuffing the packed earth floor, and retrieved the shovel from its corner, the cold-worn wood of its handle a familiar anchor in the storm of his emotions. He stepped out into the harsh glare of the midday sun, the heat a physical blow that barely registered against the internal conflagration, walking with a resolve born of desperate necessity towards the gnarled mesquite, each swing of the shovel against the resistant earth a deliberate, arduous confession. The book, when unearthed, emerged from its temporary grave, damp and bearing the faint scent of the earth, its worn leather cover a silent, eloquent testament to his solitary act. A burden now willingly shared as he carried it back into the dim light of the cabin, placing it, with a reverence he hadn't known he possessed, into her trembling hands, their fingers brushing in a brief, almost electrical contact that spoke volumes more than any uttered word.